church, let's think of some things we know about that Father. He is faithful. He is good. He is kind. He is healer. Let's sing to him as we praise this morning.
I love those words, and I love that image. As our King is risen, he is seated in majesty. You know that, don't you, right? Yes? But were you aware of this, that we are in his presence right now? In the presence of his majesty, his might, his glory. And that's why we worship. That's why we gather together, just to be reminded of that, because it's easy to lose sight of that, especially with everything as it is. So as we get started here, I want to welcome all of you here, whether you're online or in the room. Again, we have multiple sites that we have going, and there's space here. Just come join us if you are. And I want to encourage you, really, if you are alone and spending Sundays alone worshiping, get a hold of us or just come on out. I think the connection is great. I miss seeing so many of you, face to face, but it's good to know that God is bigger than any separation that we can know in this life, in this world. So, I don't know if you miss going to church, but how many are longing for the good old days? You know, you go back ages ago, like back to January and February, when you can go sit in a restaurant, it was like normal, where you didn't have to follow directional signs at Walmart, or, there were actually like lines at the airport that you had to wait in, and you go into the hospital, and if you coughed in public, you didn't feel like a mass executioner or something, right? Good old days, But again, it's just important to be reminded, I think, as we gather together as God's family, that we are his temple, his dwelling place, and he meets us in those places. He has promised to do so. God doesn't shelter in place. He doesn't social distance. Where two or more are gathered in his name about his business, he is there. And so that's this an encouraging thing, and I think zeroing in and focusing on that. I got a question for you this morning. If I had a little button up here, like those easy button things, whoever does that, and you'd come up here and hit that, in an instant, everything would go back to what you used to call normal, right? Pre-COVID, pre-Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, and all the, social unrest, pre-mask wearing, pre-social distancing. But to do that, you would miss out on all that God has for you and is trying to do in you to prepare for you for the future that he knows before you. Who would hit the button? Be tempting, though, wouldn't it? Kind of like, oh, man, get tired of this stuff. And so I think we're in a season where God is intensely, he's always there, but I think it's a time when we are positioned for him to do work in us and to begin to position us to do work through us. That we wouldn't experience otherwise. And that he wants us to grow. And the only thing that can hinder that is if we get or remain disconnected. If we just kind of, shelter down or whatever they call that and just kind of wait this through and not engage intentionally and even with greater intentionality in meeting with God, getting to know God, coming before him as we are, allowing him to speak into our lives, I think we'll miss some pretty amazing things that he has for us. But like we've been looking at in this series, The Prodigal Son, we'll be in Luke 15, going to look at the final part of that story this morning. We are prone to wonder. We have a proclivity to leave the God that we love. And so, this series, we've been hoping and praying that this would be a time when God call us back into his presence, call us deeper into his purposes, and again, build in us. Because it is easy to wonder, and I think this is a season where it's especially so. Before I get into the message, and you're looking for Luke 15, anybody glad to be here today, whether you're online or in presence here? I am. I just love it, yeah. And have you ever had this experience where you sat down with someone and just kind of updating to our current culture, and you just sat down across the table for someone or, in the room with someone, and they took out their phone and they just, turned it off, or they clicked the TV off, and they basically look and said, look, I'm turning this off so that I can focus entirely on you and our conversation. I'm getting rid of distractions so that we can connect personally. Makes you feel valued, right? So let's do that, with God today. Let's say, all the distractions, stuff that's going on in my life, stuff I'm going to do later, it's there. I know it. You know it. But right now, I just want to zero in. I want to be present with you and hear what you have to say. And, you know what's going on in my heart. So let's do that today. So let me pray and we'll get into that. Father, thank you for your presence here. Thank you for that, we get your full attention. You so long for us to receive your undiluted love. But we are prone to wonder. Man, we miss out when that happens. So, Lord, I pray today that you would remind us that we're not alone. Remind us that when our lives are in your hands, we are safe in this world. Remind us that no matter what's going on around us, you have given an irrevocable hope to us. So, Lord, speak to us. In Jesus' name, amen. So we've been looking at this series of stories. We've only been looking at the third one, but Jesus told three stories to address a single issue. And in Luke 15, verse 1 is where you find out what's really going on. And it says in that first verse, to give you the context, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law said, this man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. And then Jesus launches into these parables, and essentially, it's the same storyline that somebody lost something that was very valuable to them. They went crazy to find it. They found it, and they threw a party, right? But I just want you to understand how this is going and the context of it, so you have a visual. Because Jesus is in the room. He's with all the tax collectors, sinners, the people that good Christians don't hang around with kind of thing. And he's there with them in that setting. And we don't know how long it's been going on. They're just eating and having conversation. He's probably floating around the room, getting to know people. And over in the doorway, outside of that setting, are the religious folks. And they're peeking in. They're looking in the windows, right? And they're watching all this go down. And they're thinking, I thought this guy was spiritual. I thought, he's claiming to be a holy man, a man of God, but look at this, right? And so Jesus goes into these stories, and last week I talked about, this whole idea of what Jesus is trying to do, because once the disciples asked him once, show us the Father, we'll believe you. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen him. And so Jesus came to this earth to give us clarity about who God is, so that we can have clarity about who we are. And what he's doing in this, he's trying to clear up some real dangerous confusion. Because so often, and we've got to be very cautious about this and diligent in this, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are not true. The stories we tell ourselves about the God that we think we know are not accurate. And so Jesus is speaking into that. And we think, again, Tim Keller noted this, and he said, the original listeners weren't like moved to tears by this story. They were stunned. They were thrown off balance. I mean, they're looking at each other and going, what? And he says, basically Jesus is saying everything you ever heard, everything you ever thought about how to approach God and how God approaches you is confused and distorted. He's saying you've got to reboot all of that. And so he tells these stories to give him a clearer picture. And the younger son, we looked at last week, and he's far away, and then he finally gets up and comes home, comes to his senses. He plans his reception, but his father blows that right out of the water. By the way, it's just kind of a reminder that when we come home on God's terms, not our own. He's not going to appoint us to a slave job. He's bringing us home as sons and daughters. And so he had that party, and you would think that if it was in keeping with the other two stories he told prior, right at this point, you'd think it just flashed a big sign across the screen, and they lived happily ever after. But in verse 25, the first word is meanwhile. And if you want to hear what this is going out, see, this is an addition. This is a different in this story between the prior two that he told. And so, when I was reading this, I'm imagining, how in like movies, when they're showing everything's nice and sweet and somebody bad comes on the scene or something bad, it changes the music. In this verse, in verse 25, you should have a change of music. It goes, uh-oh, this is not good. And it says, meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead. He's alive again. He's lost and is found. And so, this different dynamic, right? The older brother's coming out of the fields. He gets word. He hears the noise, and he finds out a party's going on. And here's, just to start with, I want you to note this. What happened in that moment didn't happen in that moment. This stuff has been brewing in him for a long, long time. This is just the trigger point that causes it to erupt. He's incensed, he's appalled, he's disturbed, he's offended, and it all comes out. He's angry, he's bitter, and this has just opened the floodgate for what was already happening in his heart over whatever amount of time. And so he's angry, he's disturbed by the whole thing, he's bitter, and he refuses to go in. Welcome to distant land 2.0. The younger son was distant from the father 1.0. He left. He said, I'm out of here. The other one is just as distant from the father, and he's still living in the house. So the father, in verse 28, the same way he did with the younger, he comes to the older where he was, and while he's still a far way off, and he comes with compassion. And man, just look at what it says. The father went out to him and pleaded with him. And if you want to know what he's up to, he said, basically what happened to the younger son, will you come to your senses? You're not seeing any of this right. You're confused. Don't stay out here. And I just want to, so verse 29, it said, he answered his father. If I would change that, he unloaded on his dad. He lets him have it. Just take a look at the language that follows in there. And just look at verse 29. He answered his father, and the first thing he says is, look. He doesn't say, but Dad. It's like, look, you. Doesn't even address him relationally. He just says, look. And he says, I have served you all these years. Not I've partnered with you in the business, and how great has that been, and all that kind of stuff. And he's missing the whole thing. He said, you're here. Look, you master, you slave driver. I'm the slave. Come on here, right? You give commands, I follow them. You give orders, I carry them out. I just live. My role here in this house is just to do your bidding, and it's all dutiful. And then, the father's out there, and it's never intended to be that way. There's supposed to be this family connection, right? This bond of trust and love and partnership that everybody enjoys, everybody is blessed by. Where it should be, Dad, I know you're so good, and you're so loving. You've been so gracious to me over the years, and this has been great. But Dad, but none of that. And verse 29 says, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. I work, I work. You demand, you give expectations, I perform, you command, you make laws, I keep laws, I march in step. John Piper says this, in response to this passage in this story. He says, the message of the gospel is not God hanging out a help wanted sign. The message of the gospel is God having out a help available sign. Jesus did not come and give his life in sacrifice to enlist servants. He came to make the way possible for sons and daughters to come home. Man, we can lose sight of that. If we don't tend to what's going on in here, we can start thinking, oh, man, I got to go to church, I better do that, and I better not do that because that's what the rules say. And when we get in that place, we are as distant from our Father and distorted in our perception of him as the younger son was. And then verse 29, he says, yet you never gave me, right? In other words, he's saying, what I'm getting out of this, it's not worth what I'm putting into it. In other words, he looks at dad and said, this just isn't fair. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm carrying the load. I'm performing all that. And what I'm getting out of it, I'm getting ripped off, essentially, right? And as I go through these things, just think about this son. This is the one that lived at home, right? And this stuff is happening inside of him. And he goes, but when this son of yours, right, comes home, he squandered your property, he's sleeping around with everybody and all that kind of stuff, and he gets the fattened calf. But I've been behaving, I've been listening to your word, I've been doing my part, being the good boy, following orders, holding things together. And look, you don't even give me a goat. I mean, this isn't fair. This isn't fun for me. And so he's become blind to all he has given because his father says to him, everything I have is yours. And that's a true statement, right? If you go back to verse 12, when the younger son asked for his portion, which would have been 1/3, the older son gets the remaining 2/3. The younger son took his portion, and it says in verse 12 that he divided everything between them. And when we get in that place, right, we get blind to the blessings of God in our lives. And we think he's not being fair. The younger son thought this father was restricting his freedom. The older one thought the father was taking advantage of his service and presence. Just think of this older son, this younger son of yours. He took all your money, he squandered it away, wasted it, careless, sleeping with prostitutes. He's unfaithful, he's missing in action. I pick up the load. He was greedy, immoral, wasteful, irresponsible, ungrateful. And remember, he calls him, he says, this son of yours. I mean, he's just disowning the whole family. He says in verse 28, he refused to go in. In other words, he's there and he's saying, look, I am not going to be part of a family that lets people like them in. If we're not careful, we can start thinking it's our job to be gatekeepers to God's grace and graciousness. We can start acting like this younger son if we're not careful. You let them in, you let them join, you let them serve. Man, if they're going to be part of that church, I'm out of here. The way they did, what they did, you don't know who they are. I'm not going to be part of this ministry. I'm not going to be part of that. I'm going to go find another church worthy and deserving of my presence. We don't say it that way. But it happens, doesn't it? In verses 31, 32, my son. I mean, your son, he says, and he looks at him and says, my son. The father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found. I mean, I'm just stunned in this story at the patience of this dad with his son. I'm just amazed at his longing towards him to be restored. I mean, he doesn't interrupt his son. He doesn't slam him. He doesn't stop to correct him. He doesn't say, yeah, what do you mean? You always obey. Remember when you were 11? He doesn't pull out any of those cards. He doesn't shame him. He just listens to him. Because he's not there to prove a point. He's not there to win an argument. He's not there to put him in his place. He's there to win him and restore him to his place in his home and in his father's heart. He says in verse 31, son, you're always with me. Everything I have is yours. Don't you know that? Could it be that you've really forgotten that? Can't you see that? And in light of that, can't you see how important it is that I treat your brother the way I treat him? We had to celebrate. He wasn't just lost, he was dead. He was away, out of the place where he belonged. And so you look at this story and you think, you have these two sons, both far from the father. But the distances are different, right? The younger one, his distance was, in rebellion. It was obvious. I mean, you look at the younger son, or you have a conversation with the dad, and you tell him about it. He says, "Oh yeah. I mean, he's acting bad. He's wrong. What's wrong with him? He's the kind of guy you don't want your kids hanging around with. Yep. Sinner. Boom, for sure." But the distance to the older one, his rebellion seemed very proper. His behavior was good, as we would measure it. He was obedient, responsible. Showed up in church. He went to the Bible studies. He served in ministry. Stewarded his stuff faithfully. I love again what Tim Keller says this about the older son. He says, "What is keeping him out of the party and distance from the father is not his waywardness, it's his righteousness. Not his disobedience or rebellion, but his dutiful service." And this fattened calf triggers it all, right? Because that's a big deal. Just a little background information. When he kills the fattened calf, that was a party that the whole village would be invited to. I mean, this is like the dad saying, "This is the greatest day of my year." And he has that, right? And everybody's there. And yet the older son, just like the younger son, shames his father by not going in. See, the younger son lost his way in a distant land. The older son was living a life away from his father, sitting in the front row of a church service, week in and week out. Away from God, version 2.0. And I want to take a moment here and just take the dynamic of this older son and share with you three things. And there's more there than this, but I just wanted to highlight these, and I've called them household toxins. Things that we've got to be careful of, because if they get in our heart and we bring them into the community of God, it'll poison things. It poisons us, and it'll create distance and separation in us from our loving Father. And the first one I have is resentment. And you see this come out in this older son's anger, right? "All these years I've slaved for you. All these years I've done your bidding, obeyed your commands, and now look, you never even give me a goat, right? I've never disobeyed you." And then this boy, he's crazy. And you just think about this older son's, what his resentment did to him. He's griping to his dad about a goat, when meanwhile there's a slaughtered calf on the spit in the house, but he's going to miss it. Resentment always cheats you. And he's thinking in his own mind, in his own resentment, he says, if I were in charge of this house, people like him wouldn't get in. Forget the fattened calf. Let them feed with the pigs. That's what they deserve. And so we get in that place, and it spoils our hearts. And here's a couple things about resentment. When you are resentful, you can't be grateful. If you hold on to resentment, you cannot reconcile. You just won't do it. And what resentment blinds us to is this realization that this son didn't quite get. If I am distanced from a brother or sister, I'm distanced from our Father. If I stay bitter towards them, I remain far from Him. And when we allow that resentment to get into the family of God and the house of God, it's toxic. It's toxic. Second thing, rumors, which are usually, identifiable by and result in the fruit of condescension and criticism, And when you read this verse and he blows up and he dives in and jumps on his dad, I mean, you realize, don't you, he hasn't spoken to his father yet. He hasn't had a conversation with his brother yet, but he's come to conclusions about the character and motives of both. Now stick with me, okay? Go with me on this. Lean in, because this is just so hard to believe and wrap our minds around. But back in the Bible days, right? I mean, a couple thousand years ago, people spread rumors. I know that's hard to believe. It's shocking how that could happen. And 2,000 years later, certainly we are smarter, better educated, more graceful, more progressive, more refined, more civilized, better informed, much kinder. But, go with me. Back in Bible days, believe it or not, people spread rumors, they gossiped and slandered. That's just what it was 2,000 years ago. One person I read said this: a lie can make it around the world by the time the truth gets its shoes laced on. Rumors are killers. And it's amazing in this story, right? Stories about this younger son made it back to the hometown before he did. Secondhand smoke, the thing, prolonged exposure to secondhand smoke impairs your lungs. I'm just going to suggest that minimum exposure to secondhand stories can wreck your mind and do damage to your heart. It will certainly destroy relationships. And we live in a time that's never been worse, in my opinion. We are information overloaded, so we don't read the whole story. We look at an image, we grab a headline, we see a tweet, read a blog or a post, hear someone's opinion, who often, and those people say, my opinion is based on some unknown source that, and so it's secondhand, third-hand, and we just grab a talking point and we slap a label on a person or groups of people. And it's so destructive. And it's so dishonoring of our God. And we believe it's true whether we know that or not. It might be flat out false. It could be conveniently edited to steer it in a direction. At best, most of the time, I think it's an opinion about an opinion. And I know we've got a lot of information, and how do you handle that? But I just have to remind us all that rumors are toxic. And just like with resentment, they have no place in the Father's house. I mean, here's this son. He says, your son has blown all your resources on wild living. He's been shacking up with prostitutes. And he's been out in the fields. He hasn't talked to either one. And if you would have asked him, how do you know? He said, well, that's what I heard. Really? Be careful with them. And wouldn't it be better to err on the other side, where Scripture says, let no unkind word come out of your mouth, but only words that build up and give grace to the hearer. Wouldn't it be better if we erred on the side, hey, love covers a multitude of sins, it doesn't jump on them? And isn't it just out of this story, the reality that, if we understand God right and we live our lives into that appropriately, our hearts should be so enraptured with the extravagance of the love that He's given us, the blessing He's poured on us, the goodness of His ways, the wonder of who He is, that we hardly see each other's shortcomings. We certainly don't focus on them. And can we not, as God's people, make Him? I know I'm meddling, but hey, check the story, right? Can we make a mature decision not to form or base our opinions of anyone else or some group of people on the opinions of someone else about those people? If we don't know the truth firsthand, let's just leave it. Third thing, okay, I'll jump off of that. With his son that was toxic in this household was his proclivity to comparison. in verse 30 he says, but when this son, and you never gave me this, and you mean you're going to give him a pass after what he's done? You mean all my responsible living that doesn't measure up, it doesn't add up? And here's a couple things just about comparison. And when we allow it into our hearts, when we bring it into the household of God, it always sabotages your freedom. Comparison also will always deflect love and hinder genuine connection relationally. Comparison kills joy, it destroys peace, it makes genuine relationship and genuine celebration impossible. And comparison also will keep you from your calling. Remember John and Peter when Jesus took Peter for a walk after the resurrection and asked him, do you love me, do you love me? Do you remember that story? John 21, I think. And so they're having this conversation, and Jesus starts telling Peter about what his life's going to be, some of the directions are going to go. And Peter then points over to John and says, well, what about him? Remember Jesus' response? Basically, Jesus said, that's none of your business. Don't get in the comparison thing. Your job is to walk with me in the life I set before you. I'll take care of the others. And comparison just destroys those things, And what it does, it just spoils our heart. It becomes toxic in there. And we begin to act and react and interact in ways that just aren't healthy, right? We begin to think and respond in ways, about, we are the determiner of the extent of God's love to another. And we begin to think about ourselves as this older son, I'm here because I'm better than most, I'm better than them, or, I deserve to be here, and we look at the younger son and we think about him and we think, well, compared to him, right? I've never got drunk, or I never got high, never cheated or robbed anybody, or, visited porn sites or slept with anyone I'm not married to. I'm not wasteful and all those kind of things. But here's what we need to know. But have you ever sat in a church service critical of someone else? Condescending towards another? Man, when we do that, we just miss out on the joy and the wonder of who God is. So I want to, you all right? Okay, good. So I got a way to solve all this, all right? So we've developed, when the thing they're doing now, if you're going into like some places, they put a thermometer up to make sure that you're not carrying stuff, right? Well, we've developed one of those, and when you come into church, we're going to put it up against your chest, and it's going to put on the screen all your past sins, future sins, current sins, and then we're going to take a vote whether we should let you in or not. And just in case we miss in the screening process, we're going to put piles of rocks in each pew. If you look at someone else and you think you're better than them and deserve to be here more than they do, then fire away. Who wants to be a part of a church like that? These things are toxic. And all these things were developing and going on in this older son's heart, and he was thinking he was so good and so responsible and so spiritual. But he was as far away from his father as his younger brother. Tony Campolo tells a story in a book he wrote years ago. He was a sociologist, professor, speaker. He wrote a book called The Kingdom of Heaven is a Party. And he tells this story in his book of a trip he made over to Honolulu to lecture. And, he got there, and, it's kind of the jet lag thing. He said it was 3 a.m., he was wide awake, and he was hungry. So he went out of the hotel he was staying, he went up and down the street, he found a diner that was open 24/7. So he sat at the counter, and he said, while he's sitting there, having a little bite to eat, he said, what he describes as a horde of prostitutes came into the diner and sat all through it, and he said both sides of them, right? And after a busy night on the streets, they plopped down at the counter, and he said he was kind of awkward because he was surrounded. And he said that one prostitute on one side of him kind of leaned over in front of him and said to the one on the other side of him and said, "Hey, tomorrow's my birthday." And the other said back to her, "So what? What do you want me to do? Throw a party or buy a present? Who cares?" And the other one said, "I just wanted somebody to know." And so, after about an hour or so, they finished their food and they left and gathered up their things. And Campolo looked at the owner or cook, whoever was there. The guy's named Harry. He's kind of like the classic thing, not stained glass, but stained apron on. He's got a cigar out of his mouth, that kind of look. And he said to him, do these girls come in here every night? And he said, yeah. And he said, what about the woman sitting here on my right? Does she come in here too? He says, yeah, that's Agnes. He said, she's one of the sweet ones, has a good heart. Don't judge her by what she does. And she's here almost every night at 3. So Campolo left. Next morning, he went to the grocery store. He made some arrangements. He came back 3 a.m. that next morning. And he had balloons, he had streamers, had made a banner, happy birthday, Agnes. He brought noisemakers and the goofy hats that everybody wears for that stuff, right? He put a cake on the counter, put candles in it, and lit it. And when Agnes walked in the room, everybody shouted out, happy birthday, Agnes! And all of her friends, in Campolo are singing happy birthday to her. And he says, Agnes just collapsed. Tears streaming down her face. Campolo's like, blow out the candles, blow out the candles. She blew out the candles, and they handed her a knife. Cut the cake, and she picked it up to cut it, and she stopped. She said, I can't do it. She said, I've never had a birthday party. I've never had a birthday cake. And she said, would you mind, it would be okay if I took the cake and went and showed it to my mom? She just lives around the block, and I promise I'll bring it right back. And Campolo's like, you obviously don't understand, Agnes. The cake's yours. You can do whatever you want with it. So she took the cake and carried it like it was, the crown jewels or something. Went out the door. And after she left, Harry looked at Campolo and said, hey, you told me you were a professor. You're a preacher, aren't you? And Campolo thought about it a minute and said, yeah, I guess in a way I am. And he said, Harry says, I knew it. What kind of church do you preach at? And Campolo said, it was one of those moments where you knew right away that God had given you the right thing to say. He said, I preach at a church that throws birthday parties for prostitutes at 3 a.m. in the morning. So do I. So do I. And Harry said, if there was a church like that, I'd go to it. We know the Heavenly Father. We know His heart for people. Far from God people. Messed up lives people. Pride-filled lives people. We know what He thinks about you. We know what He's done for you. We know how He longs after you to come home. Interesting, in Luke 15, verses 31 through 32, the story just ends. We don't know whether that older son came home or not. We don't know how that resolved. But he just stops there. And this is just me, okay? But I think as he's telling this story and as the people around him, these broken lives, people living the way they weren't, God doesn't want for them, and they knew it, and they hear this, and they're stirred, and they're probably just captivated. But I think at this point in verse 31, I think Jesus, this is the way I imagine it, Jesus turned his attention from the crowded room and looked over at the doorway and said, my son, you're always with me. Everything I have belongs to you. Don't you get it? We had to celebrate. And he did that, I think, and left the story where it is, because the reality that how it ends is up to us. We can stay outside. We can stay in the distant land, version 1.0, distant land, version 2.0. Or we can come to know and believe that Jesus is telling us the truth about his Father, who he is, how he feels for us, and how he greets us when we come home. You know this, right? Nobody has a right to be here. Nobody has the right to be in God's presence by merit or worth. We're all here by grace. we all need it just as much as the other. Why don't you come home? You know, throughout this series, we've been praying about this time, and, you know, we've given opportunities. Last week we did this, but, you know, I think it may have been the second week of this. I said that you can't stay where you are and come home at the same time. So today, and band's going to come up. If you know that you're far from God, and whatever version that may be, maybe there's some activity, some thing, some messed up things, some relationship things, some practices things, some habits things, some pride things, some relational things where you're looking at people, you know, way different than God would have you do. But this morning, if you know that you are right now far from God, and you also know this morning that He's opened His heart to you and He's asked you to come home, would you do that? And I just want to make sure that that isn't just one of those things that hangs out there. Because, again, you know, it said the younger son, he got up and he went back to his father. So, if this is a day where God's saying to you, come home, and you're coming home, I'd say stand up, but you're all over in, you know, people's room. Would you put your hand up so we can celebrate that with you? If in any way you know that there's something going on that's kept you distant from God, whether you're living in the house, maybe this is the first time you've come from some really messy places, but you know it's time to leave that and come home. Would you just mark that today and put your hand up? And if you're in a group and somewhere and somebody's doing that, or you could put it right on your whatever comments and chat, say, I'm coming home. You know, let's thank God for that, huh? Let's thank God for wherever that's happening. We celebrate with you. We celebrate for you. And if that's you, would you let us know, because we want to celebrate and encourage you in that as well. Just text us, call us, whatever it might be. And for those of you who've been far from God and you're coming home, you know, and being adopted as His son or daughter, let us know. We would like to celebrate that as a church with baptism. That's how we've done it throughout history in the church. That's how God commands us to celebrate homecomings. So let me pray, and then we're going to have a song that I hope encourage you in coming home. Father, thank you for your presence here. Thank you for your love for us, your pursuit of us. Thank you that though none of us are deserving of a place in your home, none of us are deserving of the love that you have for us, you open it up and you pour it out nevertheless. And Lord, I pray that you would make it clear to us that, you know, coming home means coming home. We've got to get up from where we have been. We've got to leave some things behind. But it is far worth it for what you hold in store. So, Father, today with you we celebrate every homecoming in Jesus' name. Amen. We run to the Father. You know, what I've been praying about, and something that I'm just concerned over, is you feel that tug, you hear the call. You know that you've been living distant, but then you just, rather than run, you hesitate. And I'm just going to tell you that voice will diminish the longer you wait. And if you ever thought that you're all alone in what you're going through, you're not. If you ever thought maybe it's too late or you've gone too far, that's not the case. If you ever really thought, is the church really full of sinful people who've been forgiven and restored by the grace of the Father? It is. And that's why we celebrate who He is. And we live with one another in grace and encouragement. So today, if you're far away, come home. Thanks for being here. See you next week.